What's up, everybody? This is Professor Keegan, and I'm coming to you with our Tuesday lecture for this second to last week of class. It's our lecture for the 7th, and we have one more week and then finals, so we are getting there. Um, so, just a few quick reminders that I've been pushing to you in the beginning of each of these lectures. Um, One thing I wanted to kind of alert you all to is that I sent you all a rather detailed message via Blackboard that should have also gotten sent to your email, in which I outlined a plan for the next 3 weeks of class. It's really crucial that you review that list and take some notes so you understand how we're going to be moving through the remainder of the material and the assignments in the course. So please do take a look at that. Please do check in with me if you have any questions about what you're seeing there. Um, and if I emailed you over the weekend or yesterday or this morning about assignments that need to be cleaned up or revised or submitted, please do reach back out to me to work out a plan. It is my goal for every single one of you to be able to complete the course successfully, but we do need to maintain communication in order to do that. So some of you do need a little bit of help with some things that are sort of dangling ends that we haven't resolved from the middle of the semester. So do get back to me if you've heard from me. And hopefully we can all move successfully through this next period and move into our summer. So, where are we in the course? We are in the tail end of Unit 5, our unit on the AIDS crisis. And I'm starting with this picture because today we're covering content that helps explain kind of how we ended up in a world where gay marriage has been sort of touted as the solution to LGBTQ oppression or as the main goal that LGBTQ people should be working on politically. How did we end up there? This is, a revisitation in many ways of some of the issues we began the course with. So at the very end of this unit, we need to be thinking about how we have arrived kind of back where we began. And you might have noticed that I have organized this class to be non-teleological. So we talked about teleological error, this idea that there's a progress narrative and that we're going to arrive at, some kind of final state where LGBTQ people are equal and everything and included, right? And that, gay marriage was that endpoint. I've kind of try to design this class instead of it being a straight line as being a circular process. So we've come back around to the same set of conditions and the same time period almost that we began the class with, but we have a lot more knowledge now to apply to the situation we're looking at. So in that first unit where we started thinking about historical content, we began with the current era. It was called Thinking Queerly. And in that unit, we critically examined the LGBTQ progress narratives that we've all been exposed to by US culture, particularly mainstream culture, right? The idea that there was a bad time before Stonewall, and then Stonewall was the beginning of the gay rights movement, and then we've achieved almost total equality in that time, right? That great progress has been made. And we were thinking critically about some of the problems with those narratives. So we looked at how those recent victories that we're told to celebrate, like marriage equality and military service for LGBT people only, right? Trans people have not necessarily been included in these victories. We looked at how they support the ideologies of nationalism, capitalism, and white supremacy, and how they've been co-constituting systems with these goals. So we've kind of looked critically at like who is benefiting from these victories and what has the function of these victories been in queer culture. And then we also discussed the related problem of homonormativity, which is the idea that there, along with these sort of like legal victories, there has developed a normal way of being queer or LGBTQ. And that normal way of being, we could say gay, upholds straight norms. So there's a straight gay identity now, right? Where gay people are expected to live very similarly to straight people, invest in the same kinds of values, live in the same kinds of relationships, raise children, participate in the same institutions, and that the closer you are to that homonormative ideal of queer, the more successful you're likely to be in straight culture. The more privilege you'll tend to be able to amass. So these are problems, right? These are problems with where we've ended up. And the course has kind of made you to kind of come back to that set of problems and maybe understand better why we've arrived here. In that unit and moving through the course, we've also been thinking about two different historical strains of LGBTQ politics. So there was the homonormative strain, which really dominates US culture currently, but has its roots in an earlier period, the homophile period of the post-World War II era, early 1950s, right? With groups like the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society, people who were largely white and middle class professionals, but who had lost their jobs during the Red Scare and Lavender Scare, and really were making an argument that they could be good citizens and they should be. The only difference they had was that they were homosexual, right? And they should be let back in to this kind of citizen role. So there's that strain, and then there's the liberationist strain that we've been looking at since our beginning since looking at the beginning of the liberation period in around 1966. And that strain has its roots in groups like Gay Liberation Front, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. It is kicked off by this wave of riots between 1959 and 1969, like Compton's Cafeteria Riot or Stonewall. And this is a very different strain, right? It's a strain that's connecting queer politics to broader social movement priorities like anti-racism, anti-capitalism. It's interested in socialist collectives. It's interested in anti-imperialism and anti-war movements, right? So it's a much broader, more intersectional style of politics than the homonormative style. And I think you can see at this point in the semester that these two styles have kind of been in dialogue and yet also kind of struggling for control really since the World War II era, right? And you could think about in our current moment how the homonormative strain has been on the ascendant, and we could ask, like, do we expect it to stay on the ascendant? Do we expect the liberationist strain to come back, right? That's kind of the period we're in right now. So one of the reasons why we're looking at Schulman's book is because you might be wondering, having looked at something like ACT UP, right, during the AIDS crisis and the immense efforts and the radical vision of anti-AIDS activism in that period, you might be wondering how we went from something like that to something like we have now. What explains this transition, right? It's one of the kind of great mysteries, I think, for students who take this class, of like, why does the AIDS period feel so far away and so lost when it really is like the most recent thing before the current period we're in? What happened to create this sense of loss, diversion, this crevasse that has opened up between these two kind of generational models of queer politics? And I think Schulman's book helps us understand, through the arguments she's making, what might have taken place. So that's why we're looking at this book, to explain this transition and kind of how we arrived at the moment we're in. So what does Schulman say broadly in these two sections? We're looking at gentrification of creation and gentrification of gay politics. What does she say broadly has taken place? First, you should pay attention to the fact that she is not just examining the dynamics by which AIDS killed people or the economic outcomes. We covered that last class, where she talks about how AIDS deaths were kind of like gasoline on the fire of the privatization of New York State real estate. And so as people died, their low rent apartments could be refurbished and brought up to market rates and then resold to an entirely different class of queer people. Here in this section, she's talking about some other outcomes. She's talking about the outcome of the AIDS crisis on culture, particularly gay culture, and on politics, or on the political imagination of LGBTQ people. Like, why did we start organizing around different goals And why did we start making culture that looked very different after this period? It's kind of all the stuff you've grown up with that got made right after the AIDS crisis slowed and we finally had an end to the at least political crisis about the disease. So Schulman is saying that AIDS didn't just kill queer people, it also killed all the stuff they were making and doing. It killed it took away all the stuff they would have made. It took away all the activism they would have engaged in. It took away their roles in those communities, right? So it didn't just kill queer people, it also killed the radical spirit, she argues, of queer art and queer politics. And that this took place through what she's calling a gentrifying process, right? By which radical queer people who were often poorer, living on the margins, sometimes they were drug users, they were more commonly the people who died. And they were then replaced by, right, a wealthier set of queer people who had different values. And these were people who were looking to maybe move into cities, who had grown up in more suburban and bourgeois environments, who had gone to private schools and things like that, and were looking to come into New York and live in New York in this new kind of generation of people, right, who were taking up city spaces. Now, I know you all love the show Friends, but Friends is about those people. It's about people who are not necessarily from New York, but are part of a new gentrifying class of suburbanites who moved to New York in this period to take advantage of cheap real estate and kind of, develop a new kind of urban identity. So these people come in and they're much more concerned with security and profit making and careerism and growing their investment portfolios and buying up property. And these people are replacing the people who used to be in those same areas. So Schulman is arguing that this new class of gentrified queer people, they're coming in and like positions of authority in queer culture and politics are being emptied, and these new queer people are coming in and taking those positions of authority. And with that, they are bringing a kind of shift toward a more homonormative set of priorities. And so this is how we go from having pride parades that looked like they did in 1973 to like 1980, right, which we looked at, to having pride parades that look a lot like this, where, new gay leadership has made the choice to try to solicit funding from corporations for Pride. And so where money comes from, and then Pride becoming kind of a place to go shopping or like sign up for a MasterCard that has a rainbow on it or something like that, versus Pride being a cultural articulation of like queerness in public space and kind of resistant radical tradition that was begun by things like Compton's Cafeteria. That shift has been very much related to the processes of gentrification that Schulman's describing here. So in the first section we looked at, gentrification of creation, Schulman is looking at the effects on queer culture. So she's curious about what has happened to transform gay cultural production and why now it doesn't seem possible for queer artists to make art without corporate funding anymore. So she says that an entire generation of radical queer artists was lost during this time, and it actually can be quite shocking if you go online and just look for lists of people who were lost. Just in New York City alone, we're talking about thousands and thousands of creators. So it's not just that they were lost, but all the art they would have made was also lost. And so remember also that as these people are dying, their spaces where they're able to make art cheaply, these studios and things, these low rent studios, are also being gobbled up by real estate developers and going up to market rate, and therefore cannot be reoccupied by other artists. So art requires space and time to make it, and suddenly people don't have either of those things anymore. So she argues that the New York queer art scene was emptied out by these processes, and then in came a new gentrified network of for-profit professional programs through private universities, like MFA programs, where you would pay to get trained in how to write a novel or play by an expert, right? Or corporately funded art, right, where you would have to get sponsorship by a corporation to get money to make your art up front, so that then you would have time and funding. So these things became new requirements, And you could see how that would shift the avenues by which people who were not traditionally part of the middle class could actually make art that would get seen or heard, by the public. Now, the other half of this problem is that it's not just that artists died, it's also that the audiences for a more kind of challenging, complex queer art also died. And so, as those audiences died, and new kind of people moved into New York City from the outlying areas, right? New college grads were coming in. Think about like Chandler and Ross and Monica and Rachel and Phoebe are moving in. Maybe not Phoebe. Phoebe's okay. Everybody else, no. They're coming in, and are they going to want to go see radical queer performance art or go to like an art like a weird like queer punk band? No, they're going to want much more mainstream normative types of things. And so as the audience changes, the demand also changes. So Schulman argues that through these processes, LGBTQ art and culture were emptied of their intellectual and aesthetic diversity. Mostly, she's not saying these processes are total, but she's saying like diversity went way down, the diversity of voices and the style in which you could make things. The experimental options for art making were very restricted, and things were made far more digestible for like straight middle class audiences, for tourists, for straight families. Right? We talked about the Disney takeover of Times Square as an example of this. And so you get things like maybe one of the first queer texts any of you have ever seen, right? Rent. Now, Rent is an interesting example because the playwright who wrote this, Jonathan Larson, actually he died quite young before the play became very successful, not of AIDS, of just like some kind of heart arrhythmia or something. Jonathan Larson is a person who was a little bit younger. He was living in New York City in some of these low rent areas, but he was not an HIV positive queer artist. He had come from outside the city and moved to the spaces where queer artists had been making their work. And it's very complicated because Rent comes out of those same areas, but Larson is kind of a newer generation of people who are taking advantage of these emptying spaces. And Rent itself tells the story of low rent areas in New York City where HIV positive people were living, and the problem of gentrification and how people were being pushed out by gentrifiers, right? So Rent tells the story of this time, but it also was able to become a mainstream hit because it's very palatable to straight audiences, and ended up being on Broadway, and then a major motion picture was made of it. And so it is both a product of these conditions, but also survived them because it was on the very edge, right, of kind of this new age of gentrified queer media. So you just think about it. If you've seen Rent and love Rent, you might wonder, like, is this part of the problem? In some ways, yes. And where are the other voices telling this story? Jonathan Larson was kind of a latecomer to the scene. In the gentrification of gay politics, Schulman shifts over to thinking about how these conditions have affected the political priorities of LGBTQ people. And she's looking at how, during and immediately after the AIDS crisis. So we're talking, I think for her, it's mostly the bad period of the AIDS crisis. So things got very dire in the early 90s, like the early 90s to mid 90s are really when a lot of people start to die. As these people are dying, a new class of gay leaders is coming in, and they have a very different idea of maybe what kind of politics would be best to practice based on the kind of experience of the AIDS crisis. And so they have some priorities, like they want to leave behind the broader goals of the liberationist era because they feel that asking for all of these really radical things would alienate straight people from supporting gay and lesbian rights. And so they're like, well, we can't really include trans people. We can't really include race. We can't really include these other issues because if we do, we'll turn straight people off and they won't listen to us. So we have to distance ourselves. And so we can see again how that was a problem during sort of the GAA period. where people were saying we can't have drag queens because they send a bad message. Well, that kind of politics starts to kind of resurge in the mid 90s. Um, Two, they want to privatize most of queer life. They want to get rid of the public sexual cultures that straight people are made uncomfortable by. They want to get rid of cruising. They want to get rid of gay bars. They want to get rid of these sort of radical collective communal living situations that queer people had traditionally lived in. Some of them are actually saying, like, look, promiscuity is one reason why the AIDS crisis affected gay men so much. So maybe we shouldn't be having so much sex, right? And this was something that straight people, homophobic straight people, were also pushing, this idea that like gay men caused AIDS. So some gay men really bought that and started really arguing for monogamy in marriage as a kind of solution to the problem of gay culture. Now, this is ridiculous because promiscuity isn't necessarily a bad thing, and you can be safe and be promiscuous, you can be safe and be polyamorous, you can be safe and have lots of partners. It doesn't mean it's not inherently dangerous to live in non-monogamous ways, but some gay people started absorbing that message, a kind of like internalized homophobia. Three, they wanted to focus narrowly on formal legal equality for gay men and lesbians only. So they only wanted to kind of focus on the law and getting like legal reform so that gay men and lesbian women had rights identical to straight men and straight women. So you could see how that sounds a lot like GAA, where they're like, we can't have all these intersectional alliances. We just want to focus on gay issues. We just want to focus on changing the law. We don't want to necessarily go beyond like the legal obstacles that we are experiencing. And four, they wanted to pursue political goals that were in line with already existing norms. And this was one way in which they planned to kind of get straight people on board with their priorities, because the argument was, we just want to be like you. We want to live like you. We want to have families like you. We want the same legal rights you have. We want to participate in the same institutions you do. And by the time we're done, you'll pretty much forget that we were ever queer to begin with, right? So this is how we get marriage equality and military service as the two main goals of the LGBTQ movement post-AIDS, right up through the period we're in, where military service is accomplished in 2010 and gay marriage is accomplished in 2015. Now, Schulman argues that this is a real moment of lost vision for LGBTQ politics, and her analysis is that actually what caused this was that AIDS had this kind of unacknowledged or unexplored impact on gay men and lesbian senses of self, right? Like at the level of the individual, the AIDS crisis was so traumatizing. You can imagine, like, the government just basically agreeing that your life was worth nothing, and that thousands and thousands of people in your community could just die, and nothing would be done, and it would never be acknowledged. That generational experience, she kind of argues here, had the effect of causing some gay people to think, well, we really need straight people to like us, because otherwise, we're completely exposed. And so the politics starts to shift to really kind of privilege like these homonormative priorities, so that gay and lesbian people can get acceptance and tolerance from straight people. And of course, who gets left out? Trans people, bi people, more queer people, the kink community, all of the kinds of other allyships that LNG people could have retained here, they start to let those things go. And the official politics becomes very narrow and very much about winning straight acceptance. So, and this has to do with like trauma and like the inability to feel like we could get anything more than these few things. So, one example of how this all shows up is I wanted to show you this statue. This is in Sheridan Square in New York City, right outside the Stonewall Inn. and it is a statue by straight sculptor George Segal that was installed in 1992 called Gay Liberation. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, this statue really does kind of speak to Schulman's points, because what do we see here? We do not see a representation of radical queer anti-police resistance. We do not see trans people throwing bricks at cops. We do not see queer people lighting cop cars on fire. What we see is something where you could walk right by it and not even know that this is a statue memorializing a militant gay resistance. And you could start to think about how queer history itself, the way it's represented in the few spaces that it is often this gentrified version where if you are straight and a tourist and don't like gay people, you could walk right by this thing and not even know what you walked by, right? So it's edited to whitewash and to downplay the radical kind of liberationist history of gay culture here. And so this is one example of how, these people don't look even happy. They don't look gay at all, right? Gay isn't happy. They look depressed and worried. There doesn't seem to be a celebration of queerness at all here. It's really odd, and I think that it's a real reflection. This went up during the AIDS crisis in 1992, right? The bad years, particularly. A real example of how edited and watered down queer culture needed to be to even get into any kind of mainstream position in our culture, right? This is how tame things needed to be. Now, we're going to be moving forward. I don't want to leave you here and leave you depressed, because yes, a lot of the LGBTQ culture and politics that we've been raised with is completely distorted. It's a complete distortion of the actual history. There's a lot that's been erased. There's a lot that's been edited down and censored, like this. But it's not where we're going to leave class, because we are going to end with a little unit called Queer Futures. And we're also going to be reading the conclusion to Shamans Book, which is called Gentrification, the Pleasure of Feeling Uncomfortable, right? And so there's this question of, will liberationist politics come back? They certainly live on, but will they be in a dominant position again? History suggests that they will eventually. And there are all kinds of little degentrification movements going on all around us. So I wanted to leave you with this image, which is an example of how queer activists actually fixed the statue. Because what they did, it was vandalism, right? So there you go with your criminal intimacy. But what they did was they painted the statues and dressed them up to look like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, the trans women of color who were very, very key to Stonewall even taking place. And the statue they put below them says, Black and Latina trans women led the riot, stop the whitewashing, right? So there's always going to be, I think, in queer culture, this liberationist strain that is present and wanting more from this homonormative strain. It's always been the argument, kind of at its most pure form in the culture. So I'm going to leave it there, and next class we'll move into Queer Futures, and we'll finish up Schulman. Okay, so I'll see you over on Blackboard. Don't forget to travel over there and comment on the discussion entry for today's material, and I look forward to seeing what you all thought of this. Okay.